Welcome to The Impact Equation, conversations with leaders shaping a brighter future. With me, Adam Pike.
And me, Rafi Adelstone. With our special guests, we unlock the secrets of those who dare to transform our world. We talk to architects of change, pioneers in their fields, working towards a brighter future for us all. In each episode, we dig into each element of the impact equation.
Our guest today is one of the most influential voices in climate activism. Dr. Gail Bradbrook is the co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, the global movement that uses non-violent civil disobedience to force the climate agenda onto the world stage. Her story began in a mining town in West Yorkshire where her father worked as a miner. And by 14, Gail joined the Green Party, setting the tone for a lifetime of activism. Gail is an activist and scientist with a PhD in molecular biophysics. Prior to Extinction Rebellion, Gail was the Director of Strategy at Citizens Online from 2003 to 2017, focusing on internet accessibility for disabled users. Her work in digital inclusion and local campaigning shaped the grassroots strategies that helped Extinction Rebellion scale to more than 75 countries. She's led roadblocks, been arrested multiple times, and built one of the boldest movements of our generation, all the while raising children. Gail, a warm welcome to The Impact Equation.
Thank you. Thanks for that lovely intro.
Thanks, Gail. So, glad to start just with your personal background. Take us into that West Yorkshire mining town. Where did you grow up? What was it like in your family? And what are the seeds of your activism as a young person?
I'm 53 this year. So when I was a young person, I experienced the coal miners' strike. My dad wasn't particularly politically active in that way. In fact, he sort of put his feet up for the miners' strike, I believe, really. Got in my mum's way. But I have that body memory of what it means for a community to feel like a community. Arthur Scargill used to march past our house at least once or twice a year with the bands. There were brass bands still. Bring me to tears, actually, when I hear a brass band. And I suppose what really the thread in my life is like a deep curiosity about why things are the way they are and what are we in? How do we make change together? That's really my probably autistic special interest.
How did that first enact itself? What was your first example?
I mean, just in terms of the environment, a story that I tell, I was a very good girl as a little one. I was a very well-behaved sort of young person. And there was a field behind my house, and suddenly it started to have a factory built on it. Nobody asked me as a child whether it was okay to build a factory, and I went in and threw a sort of something over in it. I can't remember. I sort of somehow got into this half-built factory, and in a rage, well, I wouldn't say it was a rage, but I was annoyed that this thing was there. And as I went back there to look, we made a short film about it, actually. The water bodies that were alive with amphibians that aren't there anymore, around the building that's happened. And I just feel that we're in this machine that's rampaging and can never be satiated, So I've just been in that question. I was a trained scientist until 2000. I did postdoctoral research. But I was sort of, sure, I could work on rational structure-based drug design, it's called, how can we have new medicines? But the reason for ill health amongst people is not a lack of drugs. It's not the main reason. And somehow I just didn't feel that calling to stay in the depths of science. The bigger questions were not about molecular biophysics for me. They're about complex systems. If I was going to do science again, I'd probably want to study consciousness, brain science or complexity theory or some version of...
There's always time, Gail. There is always time.
Never ever doing a PhD again. Whenever anybody tells me they're about to do a PhD, I'm like, are you sure?
You mentioned sort of Arthur Scargill marching past your house. I mean, that is I can sort of imagine that in my mind's eye. I'm intrigued by sort of what or who particularly sort of inspired you. If you didn't come from a particularly sort of activist household, was there anyone or anything that particularly kind of inspired you when you look back?
One of the things that fascinates me is how movements find their way into households, like how does, and this is before the time of social media, the women's movement, I knew about it. It was in my house. And bear in mind, this is a household where my dad told my mum she wasn't allowed to have a job because it was the men that earned, you know. He did let her in the end. I'm not sure she was going to put up with him stopping her. She only ever sort of did part-time jobs as a receptionist. But it was a family of strong women, that said, amazing grandmas, nanas, they were called, my big nana and little nana, strong women in my family, but not sort of overtly feminist. But somehow I was really aware of that movement that said that women's lives could be what women wanted them to be.
Can you trace for us sort of their values, so Big Nana and Little Nana, I think you referred, and how that influenced your life?
Yeah, well, very, very different women, obviously physically different. Big Nana's my mum's mum. Neither of them are with us anymore. They both lived into their 90s. And if I'm honest, I do feel like a sort of mixture of the two of them, and my own person, of course. Big Nana had a sort of wicked sense of humour. She was quite a gossip. She would tell me about the men she was having sex with as a young person and whether they were good in bed or not, literally. I mean, she was really quite a character. She liked her bingo. She was a matriarch, and she loved nothing better than to be able to sort of generously feed her family. She lived on next to nothing. She lived simply. Her house was like free cycle before it was invented. Before you got into my nana's house, Big Nana's house, she'd be like, do you need a toaster? Because our Christine's got rid of her toaster for a new one. Don't really work properly, but can you use this slot? You know, everything had value, that war generation. And I've got some biscuits. You know, they were all sort of like dropped off the back of a lorry. God knows where they'd come from, biscuits. So that sort of thing, right? In that side of the family. Little Nana was an evangelical Christian, and she was constantly praying for people. And it was only really when she was dying that I thought, gosh, I've never, ever been with little Nana where she's not really there just in deep concern for everybody's well-being. And a lot of people from the Christian community in Wakefield came to her funeral, really unassuming. She'd be first to say she wasn't the sort of brightest, most intelligent person, but she had a depth of compassion about her. She was sort of like, Kuan Yin. Sure. There's something beautiful about her.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. And Rafi is more on the sort of, I guess, the climate side of this partnership for us. I'm come from a sort of healthcare education background. And so for me, I really want to understand why the natural world matters so much. What does it mean to you? What does it evoke for you?
Well, just to say, first of all, by the way, I was a volunteer director of the sort of governing body for the Tax Justice Network that was thinking about the corruption in big finance across the world. And I started something called Street School Economics to try and teach people economics on the streets. I don't particularly say, climate and nature is my thing. And this is part of the problem with the Green Party, I'd say, that it's sort of so identified with the environment. Like, the more how I would want to say it is, it's just not a category of things, the environment. It's even that language is odd, isn't it? We are of these lands, and we don't feel of these lands, and our connection with the lands has been severed. And I do feel particular connection with some aspects of nature, but I also know that I'm in my own process. Like, I've been on courses to do with herbalism, for example, to get to know some of the plants in my neighbourhood. It seems like it's more important to know what the model of a car is than a plant. I love little birds. And more importantly, I would say that severance from the animate world is at the heart of the spiritual crisis that underpins all the meta crises that we're in, and we're getting our arse kicked off the back of that, right?
Absolutely. So, that's definitely speaks to the root causes of the challenge. I think also the other end of the spectrum are sort of the downstream effects. They're not really necessarily just about the environment. They're about the effects on people and existential crisis it has on our well-being and ability to live, which is far beyond environment and climate. So I'd love to know, Gail, what was that light bulb moment for you? You talked about being a scientist and then, feeling that it wasn't a question to answer. What was it that sparked that shift or that focus on the climate crisis and meta crisis?
Yeah, I mean, Obviously, I'd already joined a political party as a young woman. I went to the sort of inaugural Green Party students meeting. I was the only sixth former there. I was probably the only working class person there. I don't know that for sure, but it felt weird. So politics was already of interest. I guess it's just that inquiry about how does change happen that's kept making me want to look around. The other thing to say, actually, is we talk about intersectionality when you have more than one identity. That means that in certain spaces it might be hard to be there. So being both working class and female in science comes with its challenges. And it's not because people are sort of deliberately being awful to you, but there are just things that happen that make it, well, in my experience, feel really difficult to be there. And, I was I'm being immodest now, but I got the top degree in my year and I won all these prizes and scholarships and so on. It's not that I didn't have the abilities, but still something about you feels really out of place. I think one has to work really hard to think about who's feeling on the margins of any kind of spaces and why that might be, and how to support them to feeling part of what's wanting to be there, because otherwise you're just losing really good people.
So take us into the room of when you're thinking about starting Extinction Rebellion. What was happening in your life? What was it that caused you to have that idea? How did it come about? So
the corruption disgusts me, the idea of one rule for the rich and another rule for the rest of us, right? And I'm not even there like making so-called rich people bad and wrong. Like, again, it's all part of systems. I look at what happens to our owning class in the UK with the boarding schools and the abuse that goes off there. It's all a mess. And with the Tax Justice Network, the evidence was there of whole-scale tax dodging. You've got the average person trying to make ends meet, and then this massive network of secrecy jurisdictions, they're called, that support people to avoid the law. And I was like, well, we should just have a mass tax disobedience. And so it started off about tax, not about climate. And that was in 2010. And there was a lot, because it was after the financial crisis, talking about economics, talking about finance. And it was sort of obvious that there was a major systemic issue that needed highlighting. And somehow there's something about people being together enough to be able to say no. So in 2010, it was like, I need to find another person who's equally as committed to me for mass civil disobedience. And as those years passed, and, you'd think you were finding people, and then it didn't work out. Things like fracking were coming online. I just saw them all as part of the same problem in simple terms. My spiritual practice is sort of pagan. I work with prayers that are land-based and asking life for support. I believe that, I don't know this for a fact, but my experience suggests there's a consciousness bigger than ours, and there's a physics that would make sense of that. A version of physics on the edge. Look at Jude Currivan's work on the cosmic hologram, for example. But anyway, I'm open-minded enough and humble enough. I'm also not humble all the time, but to ask life for help. And that's what I did. I went to work with the plant medicines, they call them the teacher plants, and ask for help with this project and to meet the right people. And it involves flying to Costa Rica, which is not cool, but, lots of this stuff's illegal here. And I had some internal issues with anxiety, so it was like partly to deal with that. So in a 2-week period, I was mad looking back. I took Iboga twice. I don't know if you know that plant medicine. It's the scariest shit, right? Iboga and Cambo, the monkey frog toxin, and 3 ayahuasca. And I see Adam raising his eyebrows. It's a bit nuts. Mostly what I was with was this prayer for the codes for social change, like what's in the higher consciousness, what's in me that needs to be healed.
Wow.
And we're not going to get into that story here because it's too long for your podcast, but if people are curious to hear more, I told it at Breaking Convention. If you put Breaking Convention in YouTube and my name. But basically, I got rewired by Iboga. It was an incredible experience. And the prayer for the codes for social change was answered very literally a month later when I met Roger Hallam, who told me after a 4-hour meeting that he was working on the codes for social change. He used the exact words of this prayer, which was kind of like, wow, okay, that's the sign if ever there needs to be one. And, my personal take on it, everyone have different perspectives about Extinction Rebellion, why it worked. is that there was a coming together of two really important things. Well, three actually. There was a zeitgeist. Mickey Kashtan says that you don't create a social movement, you invite it into being. It already wants to come. And all the work of the transition movement, the Green Party activism, Friends of the Earth, it was out there. People were doing the work, the permaculture, so on. People had come from building protests and gone into permacultures. All of that had gone on, right? And people were ready for the next thing, I feel. And then there's something about a container that gets created. And I always do this shape with my hands. I'm doing a circle. It's a vagina. it's very like feminine principle, this container that people feel drawn towards. I wrote with others the principles and values, and people are like, yes, this is what we want. I got the science tight on the communications, and I said that we needed to really think about grief, that people were feeling a lot, and this movement was about how we're feeling. It's not just logic, right? So we created this container, and what Roger Hallam's really brilliant at is design of a mobilisation strategy. Like, what steps and sequences do you need to do? What system do you need to create? And I always see that as an arrow going into this container, right? It's a sexual image, and boom, it was like magic. We never expected it to go global in that way. And we actually weren't set up for it to be as big as it went.
Wow.
There in somebody once said to me, this is the fastest startup there's ever been heard of in history, right? 75 countries, there's like, I think 1,500-ish groups across the world. It exploded, and it was overwhelming. It was sort of like being strapped to a roller coaster for a couple of years. I feel like we really did, even by April 2019, we'd probably done the most of what we could. And then I went on to work on XR's Money Rebellion as a sort of strategic pivot to talk about economics and finance, and the window breaking actions got going off the back of that.
What was the congruence between kind of Extinction Rebellion focused on climate and then the kind of the economic side of things? Because from what you're sharing, it sounds like there's a follow-on, there's a logic sequence that ties those things together.
Yeah. So after being in Costa Rica, I'd already been working on something called Compassionate Revolution with my friend George Barder, who I met at Occupy Democracy. And we imagined that there would be lots of different groups, but they sort of need to come together and in collective acts of art, heart, and civil disobedience. So somebody might, there's multiple issues. Somebody might, you had groups, Reclaim the Power, for example, that were focused on anti-fracking with others and were supporting movements to get into the anti-fracking. You get called up for a day of action. So you can give your life's energy for a day to something, or somebody be focused on the media. You could help other groups, but you might be in your core thing. So we always had this image that it would be different groups coming together. And we wanted to test some of the mobilisation through campaigns. So Extinction Rebellion was a campaign of Compassionate Revolution. It actually got rebranded Rising Up. It's just a sort of detail, but the company remains being called Compassionate Revolution. And so that was the thing. I mean, Roger, we were doing some anti-fracking stuff, we were doing some anti-incinerator stuff here in Stroud. Roger was working on a rent strike in London that was successful. And so he was testing out some of the design details. And there was a group of us, Claire Farrell, for example, was working with other fashion, sort of, I'll probably say this wrong, Claire, sorry, but upcycled fashion and how to work with kind of art and creativity in a way that's sustainable. So they do this block printing stuff, print on people's clothes rather than having merch and all that. So Claire's team had they chose a name for us in the end. Some of us gave them a list that Extinction Rebellion was buried in. They got that stuff. So it was something beautiful came together with these different founders that were bringing their perspectives together.
And Gail, what was the vision? So what did you hope to achieve through this? Did you have like an end goal in mind, a vision for like world that had changed as a result of your activism, or was it more about the process?
Yeah, well, Extinction Rebellion had 3 demands, and only to some extent, we achieved all of them within 6 months.
Right.
And I suppose then to say that, I can say what they were, but to say then that, part of it would be to sort of regroup and re-strategize. But once you've gone from like 10 of you to this social movement and you haven't got the systems and processes in place to make healthy decisions together, it gets tricky, right? As you can imagine. But the three demands were basically the tell the truth one. We need to be clear with people that we're in a crisis. And we wanted the government to be truthful. And then you had the Parliamentary Declaration of Rebellion, had lots of organisations and groups started declaring, they didn't declare rebellion, they declared a climate emergency. You had lots of people declaring emergencies. This is actually an emergency now. The second one was net zero target. We actually said by 2025, we knew that we were already out of time. So we had to go as fast, like a war-like mobilisation to decarbonise, and also to care for biodiversity loss as well. That we didn't want that to get lost. And the third one was like, well, how are you going to do that? So, and then of course, Theresa May on her way out set the 2050 legally binding net zero target. So 25 years too late, we think, but there you go. And then we wanted a citizens' assembly to decide on the details. Like, this is going to have a massive impact on society. How are you going to go about this? Well, there was an assembly run on the 2050 target, and there's a BBC show about it called The People versus Climate. And then, of course, the politicians ignored the results of the assembly and so on. And I have to say, I can't speak for any other founder, but I wouldn't have expected this system. This system cannot make this change. It's not going to make this change. And that would be my main thing to say is, it's great that those particular goals were met, but what really matters is building awareness, capacity, and a sense of togetherness and social movements, and understanding how to build social movements. That to me is the most important thing. XR was such a field of creativity. So many groups spun out and formed off that, from Wildcard, and who were focused on rewilding. There'd be Business Declares, looking at the sharp end of how businesses could really make it. There was many sort of produced new formations that came off that. And the movements are moving more in the direction of, we've got to start the new democracy ourselves, because they ain't going to give it us.
In terms of creating that change and effectively creating a new system, Gail, how do you conceive of going about that?
Yeah, there's a big question. Should we just...
Yeah. just get straight in.
How do you shift a paradigm?
You need to take the ayahuasca first. Go on.
Yeah. All the ones from here. But I used to joke, right? What we need is a new paradigm. I've helped birth the social movement, but getting an entire paradigm out of my vagina might be a tall order. Like, I had 2 kids, but I don't know if a paradigm's got out there. I've met medicine people since who are up for trying, funnily enough, but there you go. I'm a witch. I'll try anything. So seriously, you'll probably guess, some of you, if you know about the medicine plants. I'm not entirely joking there. I mean, I've written a blog called So Now What that you could put out with this. If I'm going to give you the summary of that, it's on my Buy Me a Coffee site. This system is based in separation. It's based from nature, from life, from our right hemispheres, however you want to go into it, through the Ian McGilchrist route or some other lens. Ian McGilchrist wrote The Matter with Things, folks. So this paradigm is based on separation, and there's systematized trauma, and it's maybe 5,000 to 10,000 years old. Human beings have done something else in the past, but because it's got an embedded success to success mechanism, if you know about systems thinking, economic growth, accumulation, profits get concentrated in few hands, you get this level of inequality. And what the historian, I think he's called Thomas Schneider, I might have got his name wrong, says is that level of inequality only gets disrupted by one of 4 things: total war, massive pandemics, violent revolution, or civilizational collapse. Personally, my understanding is we're already in the foothills of civilizational collapse, so that's what we need to reckon with. And then when a system's collapsing, what does it collapse into? I mean, what I would say is this one's delaminating and revealing what it really is. It's just a fascist project. It never cared about whether people lived or died. It might have looked after some of us in the global north and more if you're racialized as white, but it's been extracting and destroying communities for centuries. And it burned the witches and all the rest of it. So it's showing what it is. Let's not be shocked. That's what it always was. It's probably going to collapse in a way that, people talk about tech feudalism, Yanis Varoufakis. You could watch the film 2073 if you want to fill your head up with dystopian futures. tech-enabled surveillance where a few rich people are living in bunkers and gated communities, and a horror show, right? Who wants that? Even if you're super rich, like, why do you want to live like that? Chaos is the other thing that systems can do. Or they can go into a new state, but you have to try and enable that new state to arrive. It's called the third attractor or a collective agent. Daniel Schutzenberger talks about that. He gives the criteria for that. I'm working on the movements that would support this third attractor to emerge. That's very nerdy, but there you go.
A bit close to home, Gail, 'cause thinking about the current dialogue, at least in the mainstream newspapers, around the idea of growth. And our current government in the UK has a focus on growth as a solution to our fiscal problems. And they argue that without it, the NHS, the welfare system, will actually face an existential risk in and of itself. So how do you reflect on that positioning, that discussion? Is that part of the old world, the old system? And I guess baked into this, Gail, is also the sense of part of what you're sharing is around justice and harm.
Yeah.
And I guess in transitioning to the future that you envisage, how can you do that without causing harm to the most vulnerable?
It's already happening. They're already being harmed, and I'm not okay with that, just to be clear. This is going to get worse, and more people are going to die. I mean, there's sort of estimates from some scientists is like half the world's going to die. Sorry for just being so stark about it. The Deutsche Bank economist said something a few years ago. I think maybe Accenture or somebody sort of repeated what they'd said, paraphrased it. And it was basically went like this. We either carry on with a paradigm of growth, which carries on extracting from the living world and destroys the life support systems, which the finance sector is based on, in which case this civilization's finished, or we do the massive amount of change that's needed, in which case this civilization's finished. It's over. This one's done with. It's just whether you've come to terms with that or not, in my view. And the fact that the government's been elected talking about growth, there's a thing in McGilchrist's work, he talks about confabulation. The left hemisphere will make up whatever story makes it feel comfortable and well. It's like your left hemisphere is like your PR department. We think it's rational. It's completely irrational. It's like obvious if you spent any time looking at figures and yeah. I mean, the father of complexity and chaos theory, Piet Mandelbrot, he studied the finance system. It's like the house of cards built on sand, it's going. It's just a question of when.
Yeah, every civilization today is based on credit that relies on everybody else's credit working, and that's exactly what it is, a house of cards. So Gail, just talk us through, obviously what Extinction Rebellion is best known for is the civil disobedience. So what is the role of civil disobedience in pursuing or calling for that shift? Why is that the best means of delivering against that? And then I suppose, let's take it personally. How does it feel to get arrested for things that you've been doing?
Yeah. It's a tool. It's not the only one, right? It's a necessary and useful tool. And there's a lot of hard work that needs to happen in terms of community organising and building. So I don't want to reify it somehow. Where it matters is that, Gandhi talked about truth force. When you say something is so much needs to change that you're willing to put your freedom on the line for it. It speaks. So you do an activity. There are lots of there's a book called This Is an Uprising. There's lots of thinking out there. There's lots of research into civil disobedience methodologies. So like the kinds of things you can do is set up what's called a dilemma action. As long as you're willing to be arrested, you sort of set it up so that you win. So an early thing that we did was to chalk on Barclays Bank about fracking, right? Spray chalk in their corporate blue colours. And then you say, well, wash it off at the end of the day. The police come and you're like, you can arrest me if you want. You get the story. Or you have that on Barclays Bank, frack off for the day. And, however you set it up, because you're willing to be arrested, you're going to break through with a story. And we talk about how there are 3 different types of power. There's a book called Counterpower, if anybody wants to read more of this. I often say I've done all the reading, so you don't have to. But of course, there's always more to read. But in there's idea power, physical power, and economic power. Idea power is when there's an idea that's gripping the world, like climate denial. Physical power, somebody's maybe coming to chop your trees down for HS2 and you chain yourself to the tree and you stop them that way. Economic power is when you can go on strike or boycott things or whatever. So there's different ways of acting. But it really worked with idea power for XR, because things that weren't getting through to the mainstream suddenly made it in the mainstream, because you're essentially doing something weird and unexpected. Here's a trained scientist taking a hammer and chisel to a government building. That's one of the actions that I did. That's the one that saw me in court in Isleworth with 2 different juries, because I threw out the first one. My judge threw out the first one because I told them about climate change. I wasn't allowed to speak about climate change, apparently. It's not relevant. Or civil disobedience theory. I mean, the legal situation, the protest laws, is absolutely abhorrent. The games that they play. So you asked me how it felt, right? Of course, you get nervous before you do these things. But part of it for me, honestly, is there's power in the no. Like, I'm done. I'm over it. I'm done with it. You can do what you want. And let's be honest, as a person racialised as white living in the UK at the minute, getting arrested, potentially going to jail, it's a thing. But, I'm not going to get raped, unlikely in the cells like you would in other countries or etc. So I don't want to sort of overstate my sort of courage. And still it's a thing, going to court and everything. Part of me, there's a spirit of, it's quite sexual, truthfully. There's a spirit of, I think it's the witchcraft. There's a book, Witches, Sluts and Feminists. It captures something for me. We're not having it. We've got our kids, there's children, there's the mothering principle, which is in all of us, right? That we create, we protect and we nurture. And this system is not doing that. And we're just calling it out and not having it.
Not having it, I think, is really interesting sort of framing. So the civil disobedience piece, the initial purpose for that is to get the message out there, as you said, to sort of make the case and to bring something different to the mainstream, which I think you've really achieved. But I think the other piece, maybe, you tell me if I'm wrong, is to try and do that disruption, to disrupt the system, right? To try and accelerate the transition to a new one. Is that right? And if that's true, how far is it reasonable to go? So at the moment, again, the controversy is around blocking the roads, stopping people from getting to work and causing disruption and this kind of stuff, which has a damaging effect at a granular level to people's lives in the point, but has a macro effect in terms of raising awareness and trying to change, but also has this disruptive effect. So how do you think about how far to go in terms of that means to an end? Like, is there a world in which there's more?
Well, I mean, just let me pick up a point there, though. When the farmers are blockading, nobody's talking about disruption. That idea that, these disruptive people and everybody cares about the disruption, what about the disruption? The parroting of that, the right-wing talking point parroting of that is bought.
Yeah, and strikes and things have more disruption than that does, yeah.
You know what I mean? You're just like, here you go. It's like being called out. But I understand the question, though, but just to say that, first of all, it's just, where does that question really come from? It's like the what about China and India question. There are think tanks. I'm not being paranoid here, and I will answer your question. There are think tanks that sit and they think, how do we slow things down now? It's called the 12 discourses of delay. So they attack the messenger is one of them, just to say. But the disruption point, you're onto something there. It's moving from getting your story out and raising awareness. Yeah, that's important. That's happened. I keep saying, I think we've done our job on that one. There is a possibility of doing enough economic disruption to force a change. Right. But that's massive. And I don't think we've come anywhere close to that, truthfully.
What I'm imagining, so in my mind, the sort of paradigm for this is Fight Club, right? So in Fight Club, they sort of tear down the banks and they disrupt the whole financial system. Is there a lot of logical extension from what you're saying? If we think that the solution is a shift towards a new system that is post-capitalist, that is about connection, isn't the logical extension to tear the existing system down?
It's going to tear itself down, Rafi. As I said, we don't need me to tear it down. It's doing it for itself, right? And it's not really about that. I think what we would more wish to do is have enough power as movements of movements to be able to sort of get on the streets of London and say, where's our assembly? This democracy is not working for us. This democracy is, read Carol Cadwallader. She's fucking excellent, that journalist. But this nonsense where Keir Starmer's meeting up with Trump and they're sewing some deals up and then they write their own press release and the journalist it just gets published. And what are they up to? Palantir behind the scenes? It's not a democracy. It's corrupt. It's nonsense, right? We know. So anyway, that's my view. I don't think this is a functional democracy. So it's not that we are forcing policy changes on people. We're saying that people need to have a true democracy. So that would be the systemic change you'd seek. So how that could work is if people had poured into the streets of London and you start a House of the People and get rid of the House of the Lords. That's one of the, activist groups are out there fighting for that now. I mean, everybody knows you can't have a house upper chamber that's full of landed gentry and everybody's mates. Well, I think most reasonable people would agree with that. And having ordinary people chosen by a sortition, it's hardly, do you see what I mean? It's hardly like some kind of really difficult change you're asking for. But this is about power, ultimately, and social movements. Their demands can only be as big as their power is, and their power is defined by enough people coming together. And that's not easy to do because there are lots of things that get in the way of building functional, effective social movements, not least that this complex, adaptive anti-life system will respond and it will bring in laws and so on to put all our best organisers in jail.
So outside of work, I'm a trustee of a charity called Eco-Judaism, which is the Jewish community in the UK's response to the climate and nature crisis.
Okay.
And one of the things we talk about is the corollary with Quakers and the abolition movement.
Yeah.
And this idea of a social movement that came out of the sort of moral clarity of a faith-based position that then led to this very deep system change over time, and with some controversy along the way, but which really transformed the system in that way. So do we see Extinction Rebellion as like kind of a corollary of that? Is there a parallel there?
Well, yeah, thanks for your question and for your work, by the way. And I think that Jewish tradition of tikkun olam, of repairing and healing the world, is really at the heart of what's needed. Different groupings of Pan-Africans that I work with talk about holistic repair. You have that concept of the need to repair at the heart of many sort of spiritually aware communities. XR, early on, there was XR Jews was formed. There were lots of Quakers in Extinction Rebellion. There was the Faith Bridge, XR Muslims. People got together. There are a lot of pagans in XR as well, and people who don't come from a sense of a spiritual either community or practice. It's not just one thing. I personally, and I strongly think this, is that without a grounding in what I would call spiritual, other people might not like that language. I don't mind. I can use sciencey languages for it, but we're not going to get through. We're not going to make the change. It's not a mechanical thing. You apply pressure to the system and you do this. It comes from something deep within us that's with life, that is about our ancestors and the next generations. And I'm just this body here for a few years. It's just not about me, is it? The best of the faith traditions, that's what they embody. And our movements have to come from those places. You get sort of boring bureaucrats, in my opinion, that end up getting a bit anxious that we just got to make this, good for everybody. Don't be putting them off with your woo-woo stuff. And sure, be mindful of how you bring in spiritual practices, but let's root into all the traditions that are here. It's a process that my Pan-African elders call rematriation. It's how we go back to the land. And as a Jewish person, what does that mean for you? How does that, I don't know what your tradition is, Adam, but where are we coming from? What can we root back into? Yeah.
There's certainly something very powerful there. And Gail, final question for me was around, I guess, advice you would give to someone listening who is perhaps a young scientist or activist who wants to take a stand and is thinking about where to start. Because however much you try to disassociate yourself from the successes, Extinction Rebellion, as you said yourself, has been an absolute phenomenal breakout success. So what advice and guidance would you give a younger person thinking about an issue that's dear to them?
Well, I prefer Greta's line on it, which was we've failed as climate movements. I mean, it's not happening. The carbon emissions are going up, right? And still, whenever you look at social I will come to your question, but whenever you look at social movements, we can talk about the suffragettes or the civil rights movement, whatever. It's a generational struggle, and also it looks like there's been progress, and there has, but the system has stayed the same. The extractive system has stayed the same. Women get to have jobs, and then mortgages go up, that sort of thing, right? So what I would say to a young person is the good thing about this third attractor thing that I've mentioned, and check out the blog, right, if you're interested, but is it very, very much needs everybody. It very, very much needs everybody to bring the thing that theirs to bring. And there is a kind of thing that out there that sort of says, isn't it awful what we've done to the planet, what we're leaving behind for our young ones? Of course, that's true. And I often say, it's not okay what was happening. That needs to not carry on. What we've been doing has been at the cost of other species, of the land, of communities, of connection, of beauty. It's desecrating life. It needs to stop. You're being a young person at a time when has to happen. It's inevitable. And the systems thinking, third attractor, Bacana, two loop, however you want to look at it, requires the building of the new Buckminster Fuller's approach. It also needs us to hold off the old in its destruction. So wherever you're called to be there, and be there with consciousness about what this system, how it wants to live in you, how it wants to co-opt your energy, how it wants to pressurize you, but be here, mindful of that and thinking, yeah, what's mine to do? And sort of take the pressure off as well, because it's a bit hubristic. I've got to save everything. Life's doing this bigger unfolding. It's a mystery. I don't think life's intelligence makes this big a mistake. I don't think human beings are a mistake. I think we're in co-creation with life. We've got to come through some of it. It's going to be an ordeal, and let's focus on what we're building.
Thank you. Indeed, let's focus on what we're all building, which I think is a good theme for us to end on. Let's focus on what we're building, which to many respects, as we started, is the purpose of the pod, which is to focus on what we're building and ask these difficult questions of each other and listen to different voices. So Gail, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and being so open with us today. We're really grateful.
Thank you so much, Gail.
You're welcome. Thanks for your questions.
So Adam, I don't know how you feel after that. I feel like I'm really overwhelmed with ideas and thoughts and concepts. How did you find that?
I found it really fascinating because in my day-to-day, I don't talk with many people with Gail's philosophy and background and I guess experience of life and outlook. And so some of what she shared, I found resonated strongly. Some of what she shared, I found very different to what I'm used to. And I like challenging myself in that way and challenging some of the assumptions that I have and thinking more deeply. And I really liked when she shared about her early life, how what she cared about was just being deeply curious. And the question that she asked, which is, how do we make change happen? So irrespective of how we feel about the method, I think that a lot of people will agree that for many people, the system isn't set up in a way that is in any way ideal, to put it mildly, particularly related to the climate catastrophe. And I think what Extinction Rebellion have achieved is for people like me who did bury their heads in the sand to realize this is something that is critical to my children. And initially I thought, what is this strange thing? Why are they disrupting lives? But the more I thought about it, the more I think that to some extent we could be very grateful for people taking that level of sacrifice to stand up for something that if we don't do anything different, our children will suffer. And right now, people further away that we can't hear or see or touch are suffering, but that suffering will come in different forms to our door. And so it requires us to take responsibility for that in some way. So that was just some of my, I guess, pontifications, Rafi. I probably need more time to reflect on the conversation, a cold shower, and then to think again about it. But how about yourself?
Well, first of all, that was the most times the word vagina has been used on the impact equation so far, which is funny. But no, I think what really came through to me is, the world that I've operated in, the sort of corporate sustainability world, talks about these issues in abstractions in a way, like the numbers of reducing carbon emissions or accelerating transition growth agenda. When what Gail is talking about is something much, much deeper, much more philosophical, much more sort of experiential, from to drug taking in Costa Rica all the way through, which is to say that, there's a rot at the heart of our lives are led today.
I think she referred to plant-based medicine, Rafi, rather than drugs.
That's right. There's a rot at the heart of how the world operates around inequality, around distance, around lack of democracy, around the house of cards, our financial system, and everything that sits underneath it. And, to really tap into that and feel that deeply necessitates relatively strong reaction, because you're aware of the future that comes with a collapsing system, as she described it. And so in a way there's a real sacrifice to be built, not just in the action but also in the in a commitment to change, rather than, one response to that is just to sort of protect yourself, to adapt to a future that is chaotic, that she described. And that's not the choice that she's taking. The choice that she's taking is to act, and to act through collaboration and through community, which is sort of the method that she's created with others for Extinction Rebellion. And that has, been so successful in sort of sparking activism around the world. But then again, as she said, it's been a terrible failure. Apart from the beginning, raising awareness, as she said, but in terms of the objectives overall, in terms of enabling that system change, hasn't achieved it. And so, I think maybe ask the question in an unfair way, but what is the logical extension of that? How far should activists go who feel that need to sort of shift the system? Is it about accelerating that change in a way that helps everybody? There's definitely some sci-fi or some hubristic evil genius sort of story to be told around that.
Mm-hmm.
And so how can activists who sort of go down that path protect themselves from going too far? I don't know if that's the right question. Probably not. I think a more important question is if that is true and the system is at a point of collapse and on the precipice, what does it take to raise awareness? What does it take to sort of shift mindsets? What does it take to allow people to really engage with this? And it's very difficult. It's very difficult because it's too scary, I suppose. And maybe that's why Gail, obviously, she talks about being a bit autistic. You need to have a slightly different way of thinking to be able to break out of the norm, to break out of the wider culture you're operating in.
Yeah.
So I don't know, whether we're part of the problem, we're part of the solution, things that we do in our daily lives and through the podcast, and what we should be doing to raise the level of awareness. I listened to Nate Hagen's and his Great Simplification podcast, which is kind of in this space. And it's quite grim, to be honest. It's pretty depressing stuff to be spending time with. So it's much nicer to be talking about the ways in which we can affect positive change and sort of succeed within the boundaries of the existing system. And it feels much more hopeful and much more something to get on board with. But maybe that's part of the problem. I don't know.
Oh, well, a good philosophical point to end on, Rafi.
Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, Rafi.
Until next time on The Impact Equation.